So I come from a place that's been embroiled in conflict for as long as anyone can remember. And a lot of this, as an Israeli, this time in the States, especially since I've recently become a citizen here as well, it takes me back, and I get this strong feeling of deja vu to the 90s in Israel, especially to the point when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. And that point in time, I remember it so well, living there, feeling the hate, the propaganda, feeling how divided the country was. And it hasn't come out of that. It has not been able to come out of that since that moment. And so I think like most people, most Israelis, when you talk to them, especially if they live in Israel, they will tell you that the world doesn't understand Israel, that the narrative is so different outside of Israel, that you don't know how it is to live there, you're getting the wrong information, you don't really understand the conflict. So as a data scientist, I've been exploring social media, exploring news, especially information around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in this image, you see a very typical sort of display, and this effectively represents the information or conversational landscape. And what you see here are accounts on social media that are responding to a very specific event within one of the recent conflicts. In this case, it was the Israeli Defense Forces shooting a UN school in Gaza as part of the recent operation. And what you see here is a network graph that represents users on social media and their connections. Right? The larger a user is, the more central they are in this context. That means the more connections they have to other users who are talking about or responding to this specific event. And then you see these dense regions, and they're colored here to express their proximity. And they're sort of an output of an algorithm that helps us understand connectivity. So the closer they are together, it means the more connections those regions have. And this type of very polarized network is something that we see over and over and over again. And this is a static representation of a handful of people's response to one event, but this happens over and over again, many times throughout the day. And what was so striking to me is, it wasn't surprising that you see this here on the left side, there are a lot of Israeli accounts and sort of pro-Israeli accounts that are connected to each other. On the right side, it's very sort of pro-Palestinian accounts, and that is definitely not surprising. But what was striking was that when I started to look at the narratives that are emerging on either sides, they weren't fake. None of the information was false, but rather each story chose to omit very specific pieces of information in order to drive home a specific point. So on one side, on the pro-Israeli side, in this specific case, the stories were around how Hamas terrorists were shooting from the school. And that was the opening statement. And that was true. They were shooting from the proximity of the school. And on the right side, the pro-Palestinian side, the driving force of the story was around how many civilians were killed, how many Palestinians were killed. No mention of the terrorist shooting from the school. Right, so by omitting the certain piece of information but driving the narrative that you want, you sort of push people to specific directions. And so we see this happen a lot, especially in social media, and it's partly fueled from what Andrew mentioned earlier, this idea of connecting to people like you. Homophily, we see it everywhere online, but also all these ways in which we have algorithmic ranking systems. This is one display of a very commonly used ranking system called collaborative filtering. It learns from aggregate behavior from users. So just like Amazon knows how to recommend products to you, even though it doesn't know much about you, it learns from aggregate information. We have very similar systems powering a lot of social spaces, right? So Facebook uses this system to say, well, you followed the Blaze and George W. Bush, well, why don't you follow Fox News? right? Furthering our place within the network. And so this type of thing happens over and over again, and here's another example of a shooting in the States where literally you get these incredibly polarized spaces where the headlines, the news, the information that's passed is completely different and driving people further into their bubbles. And so as someone who leads the data science team at BuzzFeed, we think about this a lot, and we think that our role, like the role of media is to sort of help readers understand these spaces and navigate the spaces. And BuzzFeed has been doing a lot of reporting around sort of false and misinformation. But I'd say it's incredibly challenging as a practitioner and a data scientist who builds these ranking systems. On the one hand, I have to think about, obviously, the business side or the user engagement side. People want to consume content like that, right? So should we decide not to give it to them, right? Should we decide to squash engagement on site for some larger good? So there are a lot of questions that we grapple, especially being digital-only publication, and one that caters to the majority of youth and millennials in this country and a growing number of millennials around the world.